Imagine going to bed feeling perfectly fine, only to wake up with a death sentence written on your skin. It starts with a shiver, a sudden, unexplained fever that makes your teeth chatter even in the heat of July. Then you feel them. Hard, painful swellings the size of an apple under your arms, in your groin, and along your neck. They turn a bruised, necrotic purple, then a deep, oily black. By sunset, your lungs are filling with blood. You cough, and a spray of crimson covers your family. By tomorrow, your entire household is gone. This isn't a horror movie. This was the year 1347. In a world before germ theory, before antibiotics, and before hope, humanity faced an invisible predator so efficient it didn't just kill people, it liquidated civilization. They called it the Black Death. And the most terrifying part? We built the very roads it used to destroy us. To understand the apocalypse, you have to look at the peak. The early 14th century was not a time of darkness and stagnation. It was the medieval World Wide Web. For generations, the climate had been unusually warm. The medieval warm period. Harvests were bountiful. Population exploded. Cities like Paris, Florence, and Venice were bursting past their ancient Roman walls, becoming vibrant, chaotic, densely packed hives of human activity. More importantly, the world was connected. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that had traveled the entire length of Asia without ever leaving trade networks secured by the Mongol Empire, the Pax Mongolica. This vast network moved spices, gold, ideas, and technology across continents with unprecedented speed. It was a glorious, bustling world. But this interconnectedness was a double-edged sword. The same caravans and ships that brought wealth were about to deliver the greatest catastrophe in human history. The origin of the apocalypse lay thousands of miles from the stone streets of Paris, in the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia. Here, an ancient biological agent had existed for millennia, Yersinia Pestis. It is a bacterium of ruthless efficiency, endemic to the burrowing rodent populations, marmots and ground squirrels.
We must retreat!
For centuries, it lived in a stable ecological balance. But in the 1330s, the climate shifted. Severe droughts followed by heavy rains devastated the rodents' food sources. Driven by hunger, infected rodents migrated closer to human settlements, bringing their fleas with them. And the leap from animal to human occurred in the trading outposts along the Silk Road. The first victims likely didn't understand the cosmic scale of what was happening. News in the ancient world traveled slowly, but rumors of disaster traveled faster than merchant caravans. By the early 1340s, terrifying reports began reaching Mediterranean ports. Merchants spoke of entire civilizations in the east vanishing, of reigns of fire and pestilence that left India and Mesopotamia depopulated. The Europeans listened with a mix of horror and detachment, viewing them as distant tragedies in exotic lands. Perhaps divine retribution for foreign beliefs. They had no concept of germs. They didn't realize that the pepper and cinnamon on their tables were traveling the same road as their eventual executioner. And the geographical pivot point of this nightmare is the Crimean Peninsula. Here sat the magnificent city of Caffa, a fortified, incredibly wealthy colony of the Republic of Genoa. It was the crucial hinge connecting Asian overland routes to Mediterranean maritime networks.
Let's go now! Run for the harbor!
In 1346, Caffa was under siege by the mighty army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. The siege dragged on for months, but then a silent killer began to stalk the Mongol camps. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then thousands. Their bodies turned dark with gangrene before death. Janibeg's army was dissolving. Facing defeat, the Khan made a horrific decision that would change the course of history. In the first recorded act of large-scale biological warfare, he ordered the plague-ridden corpses of his soldiers to be loaded onto trebuchets. For days, in the sky over Caffa rained dead bodies. The Genoese defenders watched in horror as the pestilent corpses smashed onto roofs and into market squares. The psychological terror was immense, but the biological impact was immediate. The bacteria carried by the fluids of the corpses and the fleas, abandoning their cold hosts for warm living ones, infiltrated the city. The unbreakable fortress had been breached from within. Panic gripped Caffa. The wealthy Genoese merchants, realizing the city was doomed, utilized their greatest asset, their ships. 12 galleys loaded with refugees, cargo, and unseen stowaways slipped out of the harbor, fleeing past the dying Mongol army, heading for the safety of home.
Keep moving!
They sailed through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, and into the open Mediterranean,
Get to the gates!
the economic engine of Europe, and the fleeing ships became vectors of death. The Mediterranean, once the glittering heart of European commerce, had become a graveyard of floating tombs. As the Genoese galleys from Caffa drifted into the port of Messina in Sicily, the horror was no longer a rumor. It was a tangible, rotting reality. When the dock workers climbed aboard to secure the mooring lines, they didn't find sailors ready for shore leave. They found skeletons with skin. Most of the crew were already dead, their bodies decomposing in the sun. The few survivors were delirious, their breaths a foul stench of internal decay, their bodies covered in the gavoccioli, the dreaded black boils that leaked pus and blood. Messina was the test case for Europe, and it failed. Within days, the infection leapt from the ships to the docks. It wasn't just the people, yet it was the rats.
I'm warning you.
The black rat,
absolutely do not
Rattus
bathe.
rattus, was the constant, uninvited guest of medieval life. They lived in the thatch of the roofs, the grain in the silos, and the holds of every ship. As the rats died from the plague, their fleas, starving and desperate, sought new, warm hosts. They found the citizens of Messina. Panic is a faster traveler than any germ. Those who could run, did. But they carried the executioner in their clothes and their blood. From Sicily, the plague hopped to the mainland, striking Reggio and then moving like a wildfire toward the great maritime republics of Genoa and Venice. By early 1348, the Great Mortality had reached the doorsteps of the most sophisticated cities on Earth. Florence, the jewel of the Renaissance, was about to be hollowed out. Giovanni Boccaccio, witnessing the carnage, he described a world where the laws of God and man simply ceased to exist. When the plague hit a household, it didn't just take one person. It took them all. The smell of death became so thick in the narrow, sunless streets of Florence that people kept aromatic herbs and flowers pressed to their noses, hoping to filter the corrupted air. But there was no filter for the terror. The social fabric didn't just tear, it disintegrated. Boccaccio recorded chilling accounts of brothers abandoning brothers, and even parents refusing to tend to their own children, as if they were strangers. The fear of contagion was so absolute that the most sacred human bonds, the very things that make us human, were discarded in a desperate, futile bid for one more day of life. And what of the experts? The 14th century wasn't a time of ignorance. Yeah, but it was a time of the wrong knowledge. The doctors of the University of Paris, the most brilliant minds of the age, were summoned to explain the catastrophe. They looked to the heavens. They concluded that a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius had caused a pestilential atmosphere. Their cures were often more dangerous than the disease. They advised people not to bathe, believing that opening the pores would allow the miasma to enter the body. They performed bloodletting on patients already weakened by internal hemorrhaging. They lanced the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes, unknowingly aerosolizing the bacteria and speeding up the deaths of everyone in the room. They burned incense, rang bells to shatter the air, and even advised people to sit in smoke-filled rooms, hoping to outsmell the plague. When science failed, people turned to the only power left, the church. But the church was bleeding too. Priests who were expected to hear the final confessions of the dying were among the first to perish. In many parishes, the mortality rate for clergy was higher than for the general population because they stayed behind to do their duty. When the priests died, the people felt truly abandoned by God. This spiritual vacuum gave rise to the most radical and terrifying movement of the era, the flagellants. Imagine a line of hundreds of men dressed in identical white robes marked with red crosses, marching into a town square. They don't speak. They sing haunting, rhythmic dirges. Then they strip to the waist and lie on the ground in a circle. Each man carries a heavy scourge, a leather whip with iron spikes at the ends. Twice a day, in a public display of penance, They whip themselves until their backs are a raw mass of shredded flesh and blood. They believed that by taking the sins of the world onto their own bodies, they could appease the wrath of a god who seemed intent on wiping out humanity. But the flagellants brought more than just blood. They brought the plague. As they moved from town to town, they became mobile superspreaders. And when their penance failed to stop the dying, their fervor turned into a dark, violent search for a scapegoat. In the shadows of the plague, a horrific conspiracy theory was born. It was whispered in the taverns and preached in the streets. The wells have been poisoned, and despite the fact that Jewish communities were dying at the same rate as everyone else, the mob's need for a target was insatiable. In Strasbourg, in Mainz, and Cologne, thousands of innocent people were rounded up and burned alive in horrific pogroms. The Black Death had unleashed the biological end of the world, but it had also unleashed the darkest, most predatory instincts of the human soul. By 1349, the plague had crossed the English Channel. London, a city of 50,000 people, was a death trap. The narrow alleys and timber-framed houses meant that if one person caught the pneumonic strain, the version that spread through coughing, the entire street was doomed. The churchyards were full within weeks. Authorities had to resort to plague pits, massive trenches where bodies were stacked in layers like cordwood, covered with a thin dusting of lime to hide the shame of a society that could no longer afford a proper burial. Europe was now a silent continent. The sounds of industry, of trade, and of children playing had been replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the constant rhythmic tolling of the funeral bells, until the ringers themselves were too dead to pull the ropes. By 1350, the fires of the pestilence began to burn low, but only because they had run out of fuel. Across Europe, the smoke from the plague pits cleared to reveal a landscape that looked the same, but was fundamentally, jarringly different. The immediate aftermath was a haunting economic silence. In the countryside, 90% of the population lived in a system called manorialism, essentially a form of slavery. Peasants were tied to the land, owned by lords who held all the power. But the Black Death was the ultimate equalizer. It didn't care if you wore a crown or a burlap sack. When the survivors emerged, they realized something world-shifting. There were more farms than farmers. There was more work than workers. For the first time in recorded history, the peasant held the leverage. If a lord refused to pay higher wages or grant freedom, the peasant simply walked to the next manor, where a desperate landlord would offer them gold and a contract. The rigid, centuries-old backbone of the feudal system didn't just crack, it shattered. This labor shortage led to a sudden spike in wages and a dramatic drop in the price of land. A new class was born from the ashes, the middle class. People who had been dirt poor for generations suddenly found themselves with disposable income. They bought better clothes, better food, and began to question the world around them. But the psychological scars ran deeper than the economy. The collective trauma of seeing half the world die created a profound shift in the human soul. Before the plague, art was about the glory of God and the promise of heaven. After the plague, it became obsessed with the reality of the grave. This was the era of the danse macabre, the dance of death. In cathedrals and town squares, murals appeared, showing skeletons leading kings, popes, and peasants alike in a frantic, bony dance toward a shared tomb. It was a grim reminder, memento mori. Remember, you will die. This obsession with the macabre wasn't just morbid, it was a rebellion. It was a society realizing that the old structures, the church that couldn't pray the plague away, and the kings who couldn't fight it, were fragile. This new, cynical, questioning mindset was the fertile soil needed for the Renaissance. If the old world was dead, humanity had to invent a new one. They turned toward science, toward humanism, and toward a desperate, vibrant need to live life to the fullest because they knew how quickly it could be snatched away. Even our language today is a ghost of 1347. When you say the word quarantine, you are speaking the language of the Venetian merchants who forced ships to wait for 40 days, 40 giorni, on isolated islands. When children sing Ring Around the Rosie, they are, perhaps unconsciously, reciting the symptoms of a plague that killed their ancestors. the rosy
reporting on
rash,
unprecedented
the
shortages.
sachets of herbs,
Shoppers are urged
posies,
not to panic buy.
the sneezing of the mnemonic
Global
strain,
shipping grinds
and
to
the
a halt.
finality of all fall down. By 1351, you see the initial wave had subsided, but Yersinia Pestis didn't go home. It became a permanent resident of the human story. It returned in 1361, in 1374, and every few decades for the next 400 years, like a recurring nightmare that humanity could never quite wake up from. It only truly retreated when the Great Plague of London in 1665 was followed by a shift in rat populations and better hygiene, though the bacteria still exist today, lurking in the shadows of the American Southwest and Central Asia. We look back at the Black Death as a dusty chapter in a history book, a distant horror from a primitive age. But look around. In an age of global travel, dense urban living, and a crumbling trust in institutions, the echoes of 1347 are louder than ever. The empty streets of 2020, the fear of a neighbor's cough, yuck, the desperate search for a scapegoat, and the breakdown of global supply chains. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. The Black Death was the ultimate test of civilization. It proved that our systems, no matter how grand, how technological, or how divine, are only as strong as the biological reality we live in. We survived the end of the world once, we rebuilt, we innovated, we found the light again. But, as history tells us, the plague is never truly gone. It is merely waiting for the next ship to dock, the next caravan to move, and the next generation to forget. CTA. The question isn't whether history will repeat itself. The question is, when the next great mortality arrives, will we be the generation that learns or the generation that dances with the skeletons once more? Yeah, if this deep dive into the darkest chapter of our past moved you, please hit the like button. It helps the algorithm find more history seekers like you. Subscribe for more cinematic journeys into the events that shaped our world. I'm your channel name, and this is History Reborn. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next era.